this is like such a fascinating evening for me. I mean, Breaking Open the Head came out in 2002, and at that point I would go around and I would talk about ayahuasca, and nobody in New York, especially in this culture, knew what the hell I was talking about or really had any sense of what this meant or the history behind it. So for me, this is like sort of anthropologically fascinating, because I'm sort of seeing the incredible surge and accelerated development of interest in this medicine and these traditions. And I think it's very exciting. I also think there's a lot that we have to learn about this medicine. And it's not going to be necessarily an easy process. And when I hear these stories, there's a lot of stuff that comes up that gets laughed off very quickly, which is wonderful. But as we really go deeper into thinking about what this medicine means, we're going to have to go a little bit further in our own kind of exploration of perhaps what the sacred is or what shamanism is. And it's going to be a difficult transition for a lot of people, I think, to think about this stuff seriously. I mean, really, it was like when Breaking Open the Head, when I was writing it, when it came out, I just knew that I was pushing against this incredible wall of repression and the way this culture would not think about psychedelics again. I mean, it had already been 30 years since the 60s. And now it's been 40 years. What are we at, 2000? It's 40 years. We've not had any legal study, basically, on psychedelics. The door was shut, 66. These were repressed, and all these different forms of repression, legal repression and cultural repression, were utilized to stop any legitimate interest, any mainstream cultural awareness or discussion. Psychologists in universities weren't even allowed to study psychedelics. They were just taken off of the academic menu entirely. So I'm just telling you, my sense is that this is a profound cultural moment, and I think people should take that in a little bit. We're creating a new context for allowing this stuff back into the culture. And I guess I could tell you about wearing adult Depends diapers in my first downtown ceremony, and from that first experience, and I remember one of my initial visions was this intelligence of this plant going through my body. And it was like this scan, and it was like coursing through me, and I could feel it sort of checking through me. And when it had finished its scan, I then threw up. And that throwing up was, to me, it was so clear that there was this kind of medicinal intelligence in this plant material, and it was getting rid of stuff that was no good for me, that was dangerous for my future. And I've had many experiences and also collected many anecdotal experiences that really suggest there's a profound, subtle medicinal power to ayahuasca. I then was lucky enough, because I was a journalist, I got an assignment to go visit the Sequoia Indians in the Amazon in Ecuador. And that was an incredibly amazing trip. I was lucky enough to find these Indians. There had been 30,000 of them in the beginning of the 20th century. There's about 700 left. They have one last great shaman. I was lucky enough to do some ceremonies with him. And just the vibe around him, and he and his pals, they were just, even though they were totally threatened, they sort of been pushed to the edge of their existence, they were just giggling all of the time and wearing these like multicolored tunics and just hanging out in the jungle. It was awesome. And when I remember when I left the Sequoia, this is all written about in Breaking Open the Head, and taking the bus back, and there was this oil pipeline was following us down the road. And basically what I'd learned was, whenever they find oil, they go and they drill, they create a road, they build a pipeline, and within a couple of years, a couple million acres of the rainforest are gone. Whatever tribes are in that vicinity are assimilated or destroyed. The rainforest is then mestizo, settlers move in, they slash and burn agriculture to the forest. No more forests. And this has been happening in section after section of the Amazon. So then I was looking at this oil pipeline coiling out of the jungle, and I was thinking about ayahuasca, called The Cosmic Serpent, a really wonderful book by Jeremy Narby with that name. And I was thinking that this is not an accident. Something is going on here. We're at this point of tremendous threat. We're at this point where there's a tremendous evolutionary pressure on us right now. We're going through this huge planetary transition. I suppose some of you noticed, it's cold tonight, but did we have a winter in New York for most of this winter? What did we have? We had flowers blooming in December, in Christmas time. There are massive changes happening to the planetary environment. And then we have this intelligence that's from the natural world, that's a vegetable intelligence that actually works with us, and that it's a humbling experience, because in our culture, we put the ego first. We think that all that really matters is the individual's ambitions and their goal to make something of themselves in these systems that we've created. But when you take ayahuasca, that ambition is relativized, and it can be deeply humbling. It's no longer just your ego that's important. It's something, much more is going on. You're actually part of a whole system. You're part of a natural and supernatural continuum. So that, I think, is one of the massive teachings of ayahuasca. So then, I did work with ayahuasca shamans, tribal people who came to New York to do ceremonies. And a few years later, I wrote about in my second book, going down to Brazil and working with a tradition called Santo Daime. And really interesting to hear these stories today and think about my own kind of different types of experiences with ayahuasca, because the Daime is a much more structured ayahuasca experience. There are these several religions. There's, two main ones, União de Vegetalis and Santo Daime, that started in the 1920s in the rainforest. And they started when the mestizo culture was down there working as border guards or rubber tappers, and they began to interact with the Indians, and they began to drink ayahuasca with them. But because they were coming from this Christian context and this Christian culture, the images they would get would mix kind of indigenous and tribal supernatural elements with Christian elements. And they began to receive songs. They created these religions which fused together a kind of indigenous spirituality with Christian spirituality. So they sing about Jesus Christ. They sing about the Virgin Mary, who's also the mother of the forest. And they've created a whole structured container for these ceremonies, where there are these kind of hexagonal or round sort of temple churches. Everybody wears white. The men and women are separate from each other. And you sing through the whole night often, or you dance through the whole night, these little two-steps. You keep your eyes open. It's really about kind of focusing energy in a very particular way. And when I went down to Brazil on this trip to have this Santo Daime experience, I absolutely hated it. I thought at first it was the most terrible thing I'd ever experienced. And I felt all of my prejudice against anything having to do with Christianity and the Western religious tradition, anything about structure, really coming out of the sequoia, where you just lie in your hammock and they sing all night, and you kind of project these other dimensions into this realm where you're not even allowed necessarily to go into your own private realm, that you're really meant to participate in this kind of current of energy. And it really took me about 3 or 4 ceremonies in Brazil, starting in Brasilia. Then we flew down to the Amazon, took a boat deeper in the Amazon. And then finally, I just had this breakthrough. And it was this dancing ceremony. And I just was struggling against it. And I kept walking away. And I was, having the DMT experience, the big Terence McKenna trip. So I went down to my hammock to lie down, and everybody was still dancing. And it was a really beautiful little town. It was like all these different people from different cultures. I mean, this Santo Daime is pulling in people from mestizo cultures, people who've lost their tribal roots, more like white, urban types. So anyways, I was just lying down, and I was seeing what Terence McKenna describes as the machine elves of hyperspace. They were skidding around and doing things and showing me funny stuff. And after a while, I was just like, this is kind of boring, and fuck these elves. I want to go dance. So I just went back, and for the first time was able to really just like give myself over to the Santo Daime container and that way of doing it. And recently there was how many people know about the recent Supreme Court decision about ayahuasca? So recently the U.S. Supreme Court made a decision that ayahuasca could be used legally in the União de Vegetalis, which is the other one of these church traditions, which is pretty interesting. I mean, kind of surprising, except that the Native American church really laid the groundwork, and the Indians have had to fight tooth and nail for the last century to preserve any of their access to their own traditions, their own heritage. And in 1993, the Supreme Court tried to take away protection from the Native Americans, there was an Emergency Religious Freedom Act put in place. There was a lot of pressure from different groups. And I guess the Supreme Court didn't want to tangle with that issue again. Or, maybe it's just time for ayahuasca. Maybe it's something that, we need to have more access to as we go through what may be a transition process in the next few years towards more planetary culture. So, I don't know, what else can I talk about? Maybe that's enough. Anything else? Well, I also learned how to when I went down to Brazil, I also learned how to make the ayahuasca, which was a really beautiful part of my own kind of initiatory process. And as Johnny talked about in the beginning, there are two different plants. There's the ayahuasca vine, which is this kind of double helix-shaped thing that twists around these huge trees and gets really old and moldy and interesting. And then the Psychotria viridis, which are these dark green leaves that contain the DMT. And in the Daime tradition, the vine is considered the male element, and it's the force, and the leaves are considered the female element, and that's the light. And generally, you just have women will work on the leaves, and men will work on the vine, and they'll stay up, and they'll sing songs, and they'll make it a whole ritual. So I was really lucky, for whatever reason, when we took this 3-day boat ride down, with the chacruna leaves, turning them over and over to keep them from fermenting in the heat. And then when we arrived, they said, "Oh, we're not going to go to the village. We're actually going to, work on the medicine." So they took us all out, and for about 8 hours, we just worked on the leaves, cleaning the leaves, learning how to sing the songs and stuff. So that was, as a man, it was kind of special to get to do that. But the other thing about it was kind of intimidating because there was a huge pile of leaves, and as far as we knew, we had to stay there until we finished all of the leaves, which could have easily taken 4 days. But luckily, they brought in a bunch of local help and so on. So we did that, and then I also got the chance to work on the vine. And it's interesting because, as I said, it's from a rubber tapping kind of time, and they kind of used 1920s industrial technology to make the ayahuasca. So you pound the vine, and you cut it, and then you boil it in these huge boiling pots. I'm sure it's just the way they made rubber. So, and then they brew it all together, and the whole thing is sanctified through these songs and these ceremonies. And so I recommend it, It's totally legal down there. I think you'd enjoy it. Thank you very much.